It is good to see everyone this morning. In the mid-1990s, the nation of South Africa formed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Desmond Tutu was appointed to lead this commission. The purpose of this commission was to give a place for people to be able to tell their story who were victims of the apartheid government. And if you remember your history, apartheid was a brutal, racist government system in South Africa in which the white minority ruled harshly over the indigenous people. And not only did they rule harshly over them, but they limited their rights in many, many ways. They were brutal, putting them into prison, beating them, even killing them. And this went on for decades and decades and decades. And so it came to a point that when apartheid finally fell, and again, if you remember your history, Nelson Mandela was one of the leaders who was instrumental in that. But when apartheid fell and the indigenous people were able to govern themselves, the initial impulse for everybody who had been brutalized by that minority government was, and now that we're in power, we can exact revenge. But as a nation, their leaders stepped back and they said, we can do that. But then what we do is we begin perpetuating this ongoing cycle of violence, of retaliation, of revenge. And they said, no, we have got to find and choose a better way. And the way that they chose was forgiveness. And for them to say that was radical. It was radical for them to say that we are going to forgive the people who hurt us in this way over and over and over again just because of the color of our skin, just because of where we were born. But they made that choice, and that choice changed the nation. Now, I think it's very doubtful that any of us will ever be in a position that we're going to have to lead and think about forgiveness on that scale of how do we do this nationally. But forgiveness is an incredibly important thing for all of us on a very personal level, because we all need forgiveness, and we all need to grant forgiveness. In Philippians chapter 4, actually the whole book of Philippians, what we're dealing with is a church that is in turmoil because of conflict between two women in the church. Now, apparently these women are very key leaders in this church, instrumental in getting things done, well-known, well-respected. And so Paul's writing this letter because this church is disrupted. And he says, therefore, my brothers and sisters whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends. I plead with Euodia and Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. And yes, I ask you, my true companions, to help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. Now, I think it's really interesting that Paul doesn't try to jump in this and take sides. He doesn't say, well, Euodia, you're wrong, and you need to apologize to Syntyche. Or Syntyche, you shouldn't have done that, and you need to make it right with Euodia. No, he says these are both women that I dearly love. And their names are written in the book of life. But there's something going on between these ladies, and we don't know exactly what it is, but there's something going on between them. That there's hurt. There's a woundedness that's there that they've got to work through. And he goes on to say, it almost seems like he just switches gears all of a sudden from talking about these ladies, but I don't think he does. Because what he does is he goes on to say, rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And finally, brothers and sisters, whatever's true, whatever's noble, whatever's right, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And whatever you've learned or received or heard from me and seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. You see, I think what Paul is doing in switching gears like that is what he's telling Euodia and Syntyche is that there's a different environment that's possible. There's a different way of being where you can rejoice in God, where you're thinking about the good things that are going on, where you're coming back together in forgiveness, and you're restoring what this church is supposed to be. Why talk about forgiveness? Well, again, as we mentioned last week, it's because we're human, and we hurt each other. And to engage another person, to be in a relationship with anybody, is to open yourself up to the possibility of being hurt by that person. And sometimes those wounds are cruel and they're intentional. And other times, the person who hurt us doesn't even know they did it. But God made us as holistic beings. We are mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually one. Those aren't separate components of who we are, but we're holistic. And so forgiveness is a key component in processing the damage done to us in this life in a healthy way. And as I mentioned last week, forgiveness, at least my best stab at a definition of forgiveness is this. It's taking the pain of the wound and handing it over to God to carry because I cannot carry it. This frees me to graciously give and receive pardon and do my best to live in the present and take back my power and dignity by releasing the burden of the wound from the person who hurt me. When we talk about forgiveness, it's very important for us to understand that forgiveness is a process. A lot of times, or a lot of us probably grew up with that old idea of forgive and forget as if it's supposed to be an instantaneous thing that you just flip a switch. And somebody hurts you, no matter how bad they hurt you, it's just done with. As soon as they say, please forgive me, you got to let it go and it's over. But forgiveness is a process because forgiveness is grief. When we are wounded, we're grieving. We're grieving something that's been lost to us. And grief is not just a linear process. Grief, it's all over the place. You may be familiar with Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. When you lose somebody you love, you never go straight through those 5 stages. Okay? You don't hear that you've lost somebody and say, oh no, that's not possible. Well, now I'm upset because this has happened. And then a little bit later on, you're making these deals with God about, well, what could be done to fix this? And it never happens that way. It's not straight. It's not a straight through thing. You jump back and forth between those things. So a better way to think about processing through those kind of things, which includes forgiveness, the idea is, okay, if I'm here right now, the wound has happened, and I want to get here to this better place. It's never that straight line, but it's more like the stock market. We have these ups and downs. And there will be times where we're doing better, where we can accept that, yes, this has happened, and I can heal from this, and I can move forward. But then there will be other times that something will happen that will trigger us, and we'll have a dip. But when we have that little dip, no matter how far we've progressed, emotionally, in that moment, it will feel like the wound just happened all over again. And so it's important to understand that forgiveness is a process, and it's a grieving process. When you forgive, you're grieving a wound. Something has hurt you. You are grieving a loss of safety because you were in a relationship with someone and you thought it was one way, but when that injury happened, suddenly it's a different way. You're grieving a loss of trust, especially when it's somebody close to us. I never thought you would hurt me like that. You're grieving a changed relationship because moving forward, things are going to look a little different, right? You're grieving the fear of an uncertain future. What does my relationship look like with you going forward? And you grieve the pain of the work of reconciliation or of releasing the relationship, because there's going to be work involved after we're hurt. And so it's really important for the wounded person, I think, to understand that forgiveness is a process rather than a one-time event, because we need to give ourselves grace when we're working through this process. It can be easy for us to become upset with ourselves about, why am I not feeling better right now about this relationship? Or why did I feel okay about it yesterday, but now today I don't? Well, when we see it and understand that this is a process and not this one-time event, forgiveness, then we're able to give ourselves some grace and to be able to say, okay, let me give some room for God to work in this, for God to work in me, to work in my heart and in my mind as I walk through this. Desmond Tutu, who I mentioned a few moments ago, wrote a book several years ago called, aptly enough, The Book of Forgiving. And he talked about the experiences that they had in bringing forth this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how their experiences on a national level could be applied to a very much to a personal level. And he described in this book what he calls the fourfold path to forgiveness. And if you know much about the history of Desmond Tutu, he is an archbishop in the Anglican Church. He is very steeped in Christian theology and tradition. And this book radiates what Scripture tells us about forgiveness. And he describes this fourfold path. He says we've got to tell the story. We've got to name the hurt. And then there's granting forgiveness, which is a recognition of our shared humanity, meaning that, yes, we're going to be hurt, but we also hurt others. And that then we have to decide if we're going to renew or release the relationship. And the way he describes it is, he says there's two cycles we can engage, either a revenge cycle or a forgiveness cycle. And in that revenge cycle, when something happens that hurts us, at the top of the revenge cycle thing there's going to be harm or hurt or loss. There's going to be some kind of wound. And from that, there's going to be pain. That's inevitable. But when we experience that pain, that's where we get to make a choice. And if the choice that we have is to retaliate, to harm the other person, to no longer see them as a son or a daughter of God, and then to try to find some way to exact revenge on them or to hurt them back, then we just get stuck in that same loop over and over and over again. And that's what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said, is we're not going to do that. But if when we feel that pain, we make the choice to heal, and that becomes a personal choice, because remember, forgiveness is never, ever, ever for the other person's sake. That's for my sake. When I choose to forgive, it's for me, because I don't control anyone else but me. So when we make that choice to heal, then we go through this fourfold path that leads into it. And this morning, as we kind of move into the end of this, I want to look at just the first two sections of that fourfold path, and then next week we'll pick up on it again. But the question is, telling the story. Why is it important to tell the story? When I'm hurt, why do I need to tell that story? Well, the reason is our voices give us value. When we tell our story, we affirm our worth as sons and daughters of God. When we tell our story, when we are heard, when somebody acknowledges and hears us, they are saying that, yes, this is real. And you, as a son or a daughter of God, have been hurt, and you deserve to be heard. And so there's all different kinds of ways people can tell their story. They can speak it, obviously just tell it. Some people tell their story through journaling. Some people tell their story using gifts that God has given them, and maybe do it through writing a song or a poem. Or maybe they can do it through creating a piece of artwork. But use your gifts when you're hurt to tell your story in some way. Now, who do we tell the story to? Well, we don't need to go out and just air our dirty laundry to everybody. And the idea isn't just to go out there and tell our story about how we've been hurt to try and marshal the troops against the person who hurt us. That's not what we're trying to do. But find a few close confidants who you love enough to be honest with you, who you can share your story with. People who are good listeners, people who are non-judgmental, people who can help you to see your role in the story. And the question always comes up, well, do you share the story with the person who hurt you? Well, that depends on the relationship. Because if you're telling the story thinking, well, if I tell you what you did, then I'm going to feel better because you'll understand how bad you hurt me. Sometimes that works. And sometimes we just feel worse because they don't care. So it always does depend on the relationship. But we don't need to try to take that control back from God where I'm the one who's directing this story. There are challenges in telling our story because we've got to be honest. We've got to be honest about the facts of what happened. We've got to be honest about the emotions and what it did to us. And we've got to be honest about there's a risk in telling our story. Because sometimes when we tell our story, we open ourselves up to not being affirmed and being hurt all over again. But that first movement is telling our story. We've got to externalize it so we're not just carrying that hurt in our hearts. And then the second part is naming the hurt. And this is a little bit different than telling the story. Naming the hurt is where we identify exactly where that wounded us. Because if we don't do that, what happens is resentment grows if we just stuff it down. And if we just kind of stuff down naming the hurt, then typically those emotions will find some outlet and they'll usually come out as anger. When you're sharing the hurt, be specific. Be specific about how it affected you emotionally, how it affected you physically or mentally or spiritually or financially or in whatever way. Be honest about how you were hurt. And understand that when we're sharing the hurt, there are always emotional and rational sides to it. We can explain, here's how it happened very rationally. Here, this, and this happened. But when you're sharing the hurt, what you've got to do is you've got to share, what did it do to me? How did it make me feel? Again, that's part of who God made us to be. Now, neither one of these are easy, telling the story or naming the hurt. In fact, the whole process of forgiveness isn't easy. But it's a necessary process. And for us to heal as individuals, when there are hurts within a church context, there's got to be forgiveness and going through that process of that pain to get there. When there's hurt within families, we have to do that. But I promise you, it's always worth it. It's always worth it for what it will do for you coming out the other side. The greatest thing that we have is knowing that we are forgiven. We've got a perfect model of how to forgive. Jesus went through more pain, hurt, and brutality than I think any of us could ever imagine. And what were the words he spoke from the cross? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. I'm so thankful that we have a model for forgiveness as we're going through this study that we can just keep putting in front of us. I love the song that we had just a few minutes ago, Near to the Heart of God. That line that says, there is a place of full release near to the heart of God. That's forgiveness. And this morning, if we can help you in any way as you're working toward forgiving someone else, forgiving yourself, being in that right place with God, that you can see His forgiveness for you, then let us help you with that as we stand and sing this invitation song.
Mine affection, take now to the cross,